The storm had been active long before the instruments began to contradict one another. Rain fell without interruption, heavy enough to blur the boundary between sky and sea, hammering the deck of the research vessel Nereid with a consistency that erased any sense of rhythm. The North Atlantic rolled beneath the hull in slow, deliberate swells. Not violent, but massive, as if the ocean were conserving force rather than expending it. Lightning fractured the clouds at irregular intervals, briefly revealing a surface that seemed unnaturally flat between waves, its motion suppressed by something unseen. Inside the observation module, Dr. Elias Monroe monitored the bathymetric feed with the detached focus of routine until the data stream began repeating itself. The loop was subtle, precise enough to escape automated error detection, yet exact enough to be impossible. The seabed beneath the Nereid was not static, it was reorganizing. Sonar pulses returned delayed, not distorted, as though the water itself hesitated before answering. Rain streaked the reinforced glass, warping perspective, and Elias adjusted frequencies that should not have required correction. The screen responded by rendering a curvature where no curvature should exist, a shape defined entirely by absence rather than mass. The ship shuddered as a wave struck the hull, metal groaning, but the vibration beneath his boots did not match the impact. It came from deeper, rhythmic, measured, attentive. For the first time since boarding the vessel, Elias felt the distinct sensation of being monitored by something that did not rely on sight. The storm did not intensify. It compressed. Wind began circling the Nereid rather than passing over it. Rain falling at slight inward angles that suggested containment rather than movement. Reports filtered through the intercom in controlled tones, navigation systems correcting for deviations no one had entered. Internal clocks drifting out of sync by seconds, temperature fluctuations that stabilized before alarms could trigger. Elias acknowledged them absently, his attention fixed on the anomaly beneath the ship. The depth readings deepened without widening, a descent that suggested depth without distance, a plunge inward rather than downward. Sonar returns carried a low-frequency pressure that bypassed hearing entirely, settling directly into the chest and spine. Crew members reported mild disorientation, not panic, but a persistent sense of familiarity, as if each task had already been performed moments earlier under nearly identical conditions. The ship's internal clock skipped forward 3 minutes, then corrected itself without record. Elias noticed his reflection in the monitor glass lagging behind his movements by a fraction of a second. Outside, thunder began answering itself with deliberate delay. Rain struck the deck in repeating intervals. The ocean was synchronizing. As the Nereid drifted unknowingly over the center of the anomaly, the storm erased the horizon entirely. Sea and sky collapsed into a continuous field of rain and darkness, depth cues dissolving under constant precipitation. Inside the observation module, the anomaly resolved into something almost structured, not a form, but a vast curvature layered with voids, as if reality had folded repeatedly around a central absence. Data logs began recording autonomously, timestamps stacking out of sequence, overlapping, contradicting one another without triggering system warnings. Elias attempted to interrupt the process and found his commands ignored, overridden by a system priority he did not recognize. Pressure built behind his eyes, accompanied by intrusive impressions that did not feel like thoughts, but measurements imposed directly onto awareness. The storm above reached a sustained peak, lightning freezing the sea in white stillness, and for a brief moment, Elias saw the water beneath the ship glow faintly, not with light, but with recognition. The anomaly did not advance. It adjusted. Somewhere beneath the Nereid, something acknowledged that observation had occurred. The storm persisted without escalation or relief, rain falling with a consistency that made time difficult to measure. On the bridge, visibility remained limited to a narrow radius of grey motion. The ocean beyond reduced to texture rather than space. The Nereid continued to drift despite active stabilization systems, its course adjusting in increments too small to register as movement, yet too consistent to be ignored. Below deck, Elias noticed subtle discrepancies accumulating across systems. Not failures, but accommodations. Power loads redistributed themselves without command. Sonar arrays recalibrated to narrower frequency bands, as if filtering out irrelevant ranges. Internal diagnostics flagged no errors. Everything was functioning within revised parameters that no one had authorized. The anomaly beneath the ship no longer presented as an object or region. It had become an assumption embedded within every measurement, a reference point implicit rather than explicit. Crew members moved more slowly through corridors that felt marginally longer than before. Angles slightly misaligned. Bulkheads humming with a resonance that did not register as sound, but as pressure. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence, not from fear, but from a growing sense that words were unnecessary. Rain continued to strike the hull in repeating patterns, and Elias began to suspect the rhythm was no longer environmental. It was responsive. Time fractured gently, without violence. Elias could no longer recall when his shift had begun, only that it had not ended. Logs showed entries attributed to him at hours he did not remember occupying the observation module, written in his technical shorthand, but lacking his habitual redundancies. The handwriting analysis flagged them as authentic. The content described conditions he was currently observing, but framed as if already concluded. The storm outside remained unchanged, rain falling steadily, thunder arriving with delays that varied by fractions of a second. Crew members stopped asking questions about discrepancies. Instead, they adjusted, correcting for drift instinctively, stepping around spaces that were not yet obstructed, pausing before doors a moment before they opened. The anomaly's influence no longer required instrumentation to be perceived. Elias felt it in the redistribution of his thoughts, priorities dissolving, replaced by a calm attentiveness that did not feel voluntary. The ocean was no longer something beneath the ship. It was something through which the ship was being processed. Rainwater pooled along the deck drains and vanished without flowing, absorbed as if the surface itself had grown porous. The storm compressed further, rain falling more softly, but with no reduction in volume. The air thick with suspended moisture that blurred outlines and softened edges. The sea around the Nereid became unnaturally smooth, disturbed only by concentric ripples that originated beneath the hull and expanded outward before dissolving. Sonar pulses ceased to return meaningful data, yet no alarms sounded. Systems behaved as though the absence of information were expected. Elias noticed that internal communications no longer required verbal confirmation. Instructions appeared on displays moments before being needed, phrased neutrally, without attribution. The anomaly was no longer registering as external. Its presence had diffused across the vessel's internal logic, embedded in processes, in timing, in the subtle coordination of systems that no longer aligned with human intention. Rain continued to fall, tracing paths across surfaces that seemed to subtly adjust beneath it. Elias felt a growing difficulty distinguishing between his observations and the assumptions that accompanied them. The concept of departure no longer produced anxiety or relief. It felt incomplete, as if missing a necessary condition. Somewhere beneath the storm, beneath the ship, the system that had been observed continued its adjustments, patient and precise, waiting for alignment to complete. The storm no longer felt external. Rain continued to fall, but Elias struggled to locate its origin. The sound arriving without direction, pressure without impact. The observation module lights dimmed and brightened in cycles that did not correspond to power fluctuations. Adjusting instead to internal conditions, Elias could no longer fully perceive. His sense of position within the ship weakened. Corridors no longer connected spaces so much as states. Transitions occurring without the sensation of movement. Logs continued to populate, written in his voice, structured with his discipline, but describing observations he had not consciously made yet somehow recognized as accurate. The anomaly no longer appeared beneath the vessel, because beneath no longer applied. Depth had lost relevance. The ocean was present as a condition rather than a location. Rain traced lines across the reinforced glass and failed to slide downward, lingering as if surface tension itself had been redefined. Elias felt the persistent pressure behind his eyes resolve into clarity. Fear did not vanish. It was reorganized, stripped of urgency, rendered informational. Something within the system adjusted, and the storm responded, thunder spacing itself into long, deliberate intervals that made each moment feel measured rather than passing. The final resistance was subtle. Elias attempted to assert sequence, to reconstruct A before and after, but the concepts no longer held. The ship's internal clocks stabilized, not by returning to synchronization, but by agreeing on a new reference entirely. Rain fell steadily, each droplet striking with identical force, identical timing, an environment no longer influenced by variability. Crew members were no longer distinguishable by role or urgency. They moved as needed, stopped when movement was unnecessary, their actions coordinated without instruction. Elias understood then that observation had never been passive. Measurement was alignment. By recording the anomaly, by insisting on translating it into human parameters, they had offered compatibility. The ocean did not invade. It integrated. The storm functioned as a boundary, preventing dispersion, maintaining pressure while the process completed. Elias felt his thoughts expand outward, not as imagination, but as redistribution. Fragments of self no longer localized behind his eyes. Identity did not dissolve. It spread, thinned, incorporated into a structure vast enough to accommodate it without distortion. The Nereid did not sink. It did not break apart. It ceased to be discrete. Rain continued to fall as the surface above sealed seamlessly, the ocean closing without turbulence, without evidence of disturbance. No debris surfaced. No signal remained to mark the vessel's final coordinates. Satellite records would later show a transient weather system collapsing inward, leaving behind a region of anomalously calm water that resisted explanation before gradually returning to baseline. If any record persists, it is not because it was preserved, but because preservation was permitted. The storm still exists somewhere, rain falling with patient consistency, maintaining conditions suitable for observation. The system that acknowledged humanity's attention continues its work, indifferent to witness, indifferent to interpretation. Listening is no longer required. Alignment has already occurred. The record does not end. It continues, waiting, in conditions that resemble rain.